In 1880, in the vicinity of the Black Forest, near the village of Altenstieg, the bodies of two foresters from the Royal Forest Service of the Kingdom of Württemberg were discovered. They were found in a service hut in a remote part of the forest, 11 kilometers from the nearest settlement. The bodies were mutilated with multiple deep wounds, as if they had been torn apart by giant claws. The investigation was conducted on suspicion of murder, but what investigators found in the senior forester's diary caused many to doubt that there was a rational explanation for what had happened. Among the pages of the diary, they found a long gray feather unlike any known in these parts. A group of foresters arrived in the northwestern part of the Black Forest on September 23, 1880. There were 5 of them. The senior forester, Karl Weber, a 52-year-old man with a graying beard and a back bent by 30 years of service in the Royal Forests. His assistant, Friedrich Schmidt, a sturdy 40-year-old man with a scar across his left eyebrow. Johannes Müller, a young keeper aged 28, recently transferred from the Bavarian forests. Gustav Hoffmann, an experienced tracker aged 55, who had lived in these parts all his life. And Otto Zimmermann, the youngest of the group, aged 23, who had only joined the service a year ago. Their task was to make an autumn inspection of remote areas, check the condition of forest paths and trails, record damage to trees, and identify signs of illegal logging. This area was located in the deepest part of the Black Forest, where centuries-old fir trees closed their crowns so tightly that even at noon it was dim under them. The nearest village, Altenstieg, was 11 kilometers to the southeast, and the service hut itself stood on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by century-old pines and firs. The hut had been built during the reign of the current king's grandfather. It was a sturdy structure made of thick logs with a gabled roof covered with shingles, a stone hearth, and 2 rooms. One served as a common bedroom with wooden bunks along the walls, the other as a storage room for tools and supplies. They arrived at the hut towards evening. The day was cloudy, with low gray clouds clinging to the treetops. The air was damp and cold, smelling of rotten leaves, moss, and tree resin. Weber was the first to go inside, inspect the room, and check the condition of the hearth. The interior smelled musty and damp. The hut had not been visited since spring. The floor was covered with old fir branches that had dried out and gave off a pungent smell. Muller and Zimmermann began unloading the cart. Bags of flour, salted meat, dried vegetables, a barrel of water, kerosene lanterns, axes, saws, ropes. Hoffmann inspected the area around the hut and checked the condition of the wood pile under the shed. The wood was dry, cut back in the spring. By nightfall, the weather had cleared. The moon rose almost full, and its light, breaking through the treetops, fell in silvery patches on the clearing in front of the hut. Fir logs crackled in the hearth, and the heat gradually dispelled the dampness from the room. The foresters dined on rye bread with salted meat, washing it down with hot chicory coffee, which they brewed in an old, smoky pot. Hoffmann told how this spring he had found bear tracks the size of a plate on one of the trails, but had never seen the animal itself. Schmidt recalled an incident 10 years ago when the body of a hunter, torn apart by wolves, was found on a neighboring plot. Weber listened silently, filling his clay pipe with tobacco. He had served in these forests longer than anyone else, and knew that the Black Forest kept its secrets, which were better left unsaid. The first night passed quietly. The foresters slept on bunks, covered with woolen blankets. The fire in the hearth gradually died down, leaving only smoldering coals. Outside, the usual nighttime sounds of the forest could be heard. The rustling of branches, the distant hooting of an owl, the crackling of cooling tree trunks. Work began at dawn. Weber divided the area into 5 parts. Each forester had to go around their zone, mark damaged trees on maps, and check the condition of the clearings. Müller and Zimmermann were assigned the eastern section, where the forest sloped down to a small stream. Schmidt headed north to the old burn site, where a lightning strike had caused a fire 3 years earlier. Hoffmann took the western part, the most remote and difficult to traverse. Weber kept the southern direction for himself, towards the old lumberjack cemetery, abandoned at the beginning of the century. It was quiet in the forest during the day. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin rays, illuminating columns of pollen and forest vapors. The ground beneath their feet was soft from years of pine needles and decayed leaves. Weber walked slowly, stopping at every large tree and making chalk marks on the bark of those that required attention. His pocket watch showed 1:30 in the afternoon when he heard the first sound. A click. Clear, sharp, as if someone had snapped their fingers. Weber stopped and listened. Silence. Only the rustling of leaves high above. He waited another minute, decided it was a dry branch cracking under someone's foot, and moved on. 10 minutes later, the sound repeated itself. A click. This time, a little closer, a little louder. Weber turned around and looked at the forest behind him. The trunks of the fir trees stretched back in rows, with gloomy gaps between them where almost no light penetrated. Nothing unusual. He remembered the woodpeckers. At this time of year, they were busy stocking up on food, pecking at the bark. But the sound was not like that. A woodpecker taps quickly, in short bursts. This was a single click, as if someone had cracked their knuckles. By evening, Weber was the last to return to the hut. The others were already sitting by the hearth, warming their hands over the fire. Schmidt complained of pain in his knee, an old injury that flared up in damp weather. Zimmerman cleaned the mud off his boots. Mueller was sorting through his notes, checking them against the map. Hoffman was cooking soup from dried peas and smoked bacon. The smell was thick and satisfying. Weber went to his place on the bunk, took off his wet wool jacket, and hung it up to dry by the hearth. He didn't mention the clicks. It was too insignificant a detail to draw attention to. The clicks repeated themselves during the night. Weber woke up in complete darkness. The fire in the hearth had long since gone out, leaving only a faint reddish glow from the coals. He was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, when he heard a sound outside. Click. Pause. Click. Pause. Click. Rhythmic, measured, as if someone were slowly counting the time. Weber propped himself up on his elbow and listened. The sound came from the forest, about 30 meters from the hut. He looked at the other foresters. They were all asleep. Schmidt's heavy breathing, Hoffman's quiet snoring, young Zimmerman's snoring. Only Mueller was tossing and turning on his bunk, muttering something in his sleep. Weber got up, stepped barefoot onto the cold wooden floor, and walked over to the window. The moon was shining brightly, illuminating the clearing with a ghostly silver light. The shadows of the trees lay in black stripes. Everything was motionless. The clicking had stopped. Weber stood at the window for a few more minutes, peering into the darkness between the tree trunks, but heard nothing more. He returned to his bunk and covered himself with a blanket. Sleep did not come. He lay with his eyes open, listening to the sounds of the night. But the clicks did not recur. In the morning, he felt exhausted. His head ached with a dull, throbbing pain, and his mouth felt dry. At breakfast, Hoffman noticed that Weber looked tired and asked if he was feeling ill. Weber replied that he had simply slept poorly because of the hardness of the bed. Hoffman suggested putting an extra blanket under his back, but Weber waved him off. After breakfast, they went back to their respective areas. That day, Weber surveyed the western part of his zone, where the forest was particularly dense and old. The trees here had been growing for 2 or even 3 centuries. Thick trunks covered with moss, with gnarled roots pushing up the ground. Sunlight barely penetrated here, and even at noon there was a greenish twilight. The air was heavy and humid, smelling of rot and mushrooms. Weber walked slowly, pushing aside low branches and stepping over fallen trunks covered with moss. Click. He stopped dead in his tracks. The sound was very close, about 10 steps behind him. Weber slowly turned around, his hand reaching for the handle of the hunting knife on his belt. There was no one among the trees, only trunks, moss, and twilight. He stood motionless, holding his breath. The silence was deafening. A click. Now to the right, a little further. Weber turned his head sharply in that direction. Nothing. His heart began to beat faster. He tried to calm down, telling himself it was a bird or a squirrel or some other forest animal. But the sound was unnatural, too loud for a bird, too sharp for a squirrel. He hurried back to the hut without waiting for the end of the working day. When he reached the clearing, the sun was still high in the sky, but the air was already beginning to cool. Autumn was taking its toll. In the hut, he found only Mueller, who had returned early with a headache. The young forester was sitting by the hearth, holding his temples with his hands, his face pale. Weber asked what had happened. Mueller replied that he had been hearing strange noises in the forest all day, some kind of clicking, and it had given him a headache. Weber felt a chill run down his spine. He asked where exactly Mueller had heard these sounds. He pointed to the map, the eastern section, not far from the stream. Weber took out his map and marked the place where he himself had heard the clicks. The 2 points were almost 3 kilometers apart. He asked Mueller if he had seen anything unusual. The young forester shook his head and said he had only seen trees and shadows, but felt as if he was being watched. Weber told him to rest, poured water from a barrel into a mug, and gave it to him to drink. Mueller thanked him, lay down on the bunk, and covered himself with a blanket. When the others returned, Weber did not mention the clicks. He decided to wait and see if anyone else heard the sounds. Dinner passed with the usual conversations. Hoffman found traces of a wild boar. Schmidt discovered an old trap, long, rusted, and overgrown with moss. Zimmerman complained that he had stubbed his toe on a root and was now limping. Only Mueller was silent, eating without appetite, constantly looking up and staring out the window where dusk was gathering. That night, the clicks were louder and closer. Weber woke up to Mueller shaking his shoulder. The young forester was as pale as a sheet, his eyes shining in the darkness. He pressed his finger to his lips, signaling silence, then pointed to the window. Weber got up and went over. The clicks came from outside, very close to the hut. Click. A pause of 3 heartbeats. Click. Pause. Click. Measured, methodical, as if someone were counting steps as they approached. Weber looked at the others. They were all fast asleep. He turned to Mueller and whispered, asking if he could hear the sounds. Mueller nodded, his lips trembling. Weber took a kerosene lamp from the table and lit the wick. Yellow lights spread across the room, casting long shadows on the walls. The 2 of them approached the door. Weber put his ear to the tree. The clicks came from the forest, from the edge of the clearing. He took a double-barreled shotgun from the wall and checked to see if it was loaded. Both barrels were loaded with buckshot. Mueller grabbed an axe. Weber slowly opened the door. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine needles. The moon was shining brightly, and the clearing was clearly visible. Empty. Not a single shadow, not a single movement. The clicking stopped the moment the door opened. There was absolute silence. There was not even a breeze. Not even the owls were hooting. Weber stepped onto the threshold, peering into the darkness between the trees. Mueller stood behind him, clutching the axe with both hands. A minute passed. Another. The silence remained unbroken. Weber went back inside and bolted the door. Mueller asked what that was. Weber replied that he didn't know, but in the morning they would talk to Hoffman. The old tracker knew these woods better than anyone. Maybe he would have some insight. Mueller nodded and returned to his bunk. Weber left the lamp burning on the table. Sleep was no longer possible. He sat on the edge of the bunk, holding his rifle on his knees, and listened. But nothing else happened before dawn. In the morning, Weber took Hoffman aside and told him about the clicks. The old tracker listened attentively, scratching his gray beard. When Weber finished, Hoffman was silent for a long time, staring off toward the forest. Then he said that his grandfather, also a forester, had told him an old story when he was a child. Deep in these woods, where no human foot ever treads, something lives. The old men called it tic-tac-lied. Long-legged with a bird's beak, it hunts those who have broken the laws of the forest. It watches for months, turning its long neck, and its vertebrae make clicking sounds. Only those it has chosen can hear these sounds. When the clicks stop, it means the creature has finished watching and started hunting. Weber asked if Hoffman believed in these tales. The old man shrugged and said that many things happen in the Black Forest that cannot be explained. His grandfather warned him never to say that name aloud in the forest. Whoever utters it will hear the clicks, and whoever hears them is doomed. Weber smiled, calling it superstition, but deep down he felt a twinge of anxiety. Hoffman advised them to be careful, not to go into the forest alone, and to keep their weapons ready. Weber agreed. That day, they worked in groups. Weber took Mueller with him. Hoffman took Schmidt and Zimmerman. They walked slowly, stopping often to listen. But there were no clicks during the day. The forest was normal, rustling with leaves, creaking with trunks, smelling of resin. Birds sang, squirrels jumped from branch to branch. Nothing strange. In the evening, when they returned to the hut, Weber decided to study the old records that were kept in a wooden box under the bunks. They were the diaries of previous foresters, reports, maps. He leafed through the yellowed pages covered in faded ink until he found an entry from 1862. Forester Herman Krause wrote that in August of that year, 2 lumberjacks had disappeared in the forest. They were searched for a week and found dead 5 kilometers west of the hut. Their bodies were mutilated with multiple deep wounds, as if they had been torn apart by the claws of a large predator. No bears had been seen in the area for several years, nor had any wolves. Krause wrote that the wounds were strange, too deep, too smooth, as if they had been inflicted not by teeth, but by something sharp and hard, like knife blades. Further on, Weber found records from 1848. Forester Friedrich Baumann reported the disappearance of a hunter in April. A month later, his remains were found. Only bones, stripped to the bone, scattered over a large area. The skull was smashed. Baumann noted that the locals whispered about an old curse on the forest, but he didn't think much of it. Weber closed the diaries and put them back in the box. His hands were shaking slightly. He looked at the others. Schmidt and Zimmerman were playing cards by lamplight. Hoffman was repairing the strap of his backpack, and Mueller was lying on his bunk staring at the ceiling. Weber decided not to say anything about his findings. There was no point in scaring people. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. Perhaps it was an animal unknown to science, or a feral dog. Anything but the fairy tales Hoffman had talked about. At night, the clicks returned. Weber and Mueller woke up at the same time again and looked at each other in the dark. The sounds came in circles around the hut. First, from the north, click, click, click. Then, from the east, click, click. Then, from the south. They moved as if someone was walking around the building, examining it. Weber stood up, grabbed his rifle, and went to the window. The moon disappeared behind the clouds, and the clearing was plunged into impenetrable darkness. He couldn't see anything. Only the black silhouettes of trees and the black patch of forest. The clicks continued. Closer. Louder. Weber felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Mueller approached him, holding an axe. His face was deathly pale in the dim light from the coals in the hearth. His eyes wide open. He whispered that it was coming. Weber nodded. They stood by the window, straining to see into the darkness. The clicks suddenly stopped. There was a silence so thick that the blood rushed in their ears. Weber swallowed, his mouth dry. He raised his rifle, aiming at the window, his finger resting on the trigger. Then they heard footsteps. Heavy, slow. Something very large was moving toward the hut. The ground trembled slightly under these footsteps. Weber stepped back from the window and ordered Mueller to move away. The footsteps approached the very wall of the hut. They stopped. Weber could hear his own breathing, rapid and uneven. He heard Mueller whispering a quiet prayer. A minute passed. Another. Footsteps circled the perimeter of the hut, slowly, methodically. They stopped at the door. The door was solid, made of oak, with iron hinges and a massive bolt. But at that moment, Weber felt as if it were thin plywood that could be broken with a single blow. He stood with his rifle pointed at the door, ready to shoot at the first movement. Mueller pressed his back against the wall, gripping his axe so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Outside, there was a long, drawn-out creak. It was as if someone was slowly scratching their claws across the wood of the door, from top to bottom, leaving deep grooves. The sound was disgusting, making his teeth grind. The creaking continued for several seconds, then stopped. Silence. The footsteps receded. They went back into the forest. Weber and Mueller stood motionless for a long time, afraid to move. Only when it began to grow light outside from the approaching dawn did Weber lower his rifle and exhale. He walked over to the door and examined it by lamplight. 4 deep grooves were visible on the oak boards, running parallel from top to bottom. They were as deep as a finger, as if steel blades had been run across the wood. Mueller came over, looked, and recoiled. He said they had to leave immediately before it came back. Weber replied that it was several hours until dawn, and walking through the forest in the dark would be suicide. They would wait until morning, wake the others, tell them everything, and make a decision together. When dawn broke, Weber gathered everyone around the fire. He showed them the scratches on the door. He told them about the clicks, the discoveries in the old diaries, and Hoffman's words. Schmidt listened with disbelief, called it nonsense, and said that the scratches could have been made by a bear. Zimmerman remained silent, staring at the floor. Hoffman examined the scratches, shook his head, and said that a bear scratches differently. Its claws leave wider and more uneven grooves. This was something else. Weber offered two options. Either they all go to Altenstieg together and report what was happening, or they stay and defend the hut in a circle, not leaving it one by one. Schmidt insisted on staying. He didn't want to look like a coward running away from fairy tales. Zimmerman supported him, although his voice trembled. Hoffman said that the decision was up to the senior forester. Mueller was silent, but Weber saw fear in his eyes. Weber decided to stay. They had come here with a mission, and he couldn't return without completing it. But he set strict rules. No one goes into the forest alone. All movements are only in groups of at least 3. Weapons are always carried, and at night, someone is on duty at the door. Everyone agreed. The day passed in anxious anticipation. They explored the immediate surroundings of the hut, gathered extra firewood, and checked their weapons. Schmidt found strange tracks at the edge of the forest. Long, narrow prints, like bird feet, but the size of a human foot. 3 clawed toes in front, 1 behind. The footprint was deep, as if the creature weighed a lot. Hoffman measured the footprint. It was almost 30 centimeters long. He said he had never seen anything like it. The tracks went in a circle around the hut, about 30 steps from the walls. A complete circle. A closed loop, as if someone had methodically walked around the area, studying it. In some places, the tracks overlapped, showing that the creature had passed through here multiple times. Zimmerman suggested that it was a large bird from the zoo that had escaped, perhaps an African crane or heron. Hoffman shook his head. Such birds were rare even in large cities, and they certainly weren't kept in the Black Forest. Besides, the tracks were too large and deep for a bird. In the evening, they locked themselves in the hut. Weber set up a duty roster. 2 people at a time, changing every 3 hours. Schmidt and Hoffman took the first watch. The rest went to bed, but no one could sleep. They lay with their eyes open, listening to every sound. A bright fire burned in the hearth, casting restless shadows on the walls. The clicks began at 10 o'clock in the evening. Schmidt and Hoffman were sitting at the table when they heard the first sound. They exchanged glances. Schmidt got up and went to the window. Hoffman grabbed his rifle. The clicks came from all sides at once, as if there were several sources of sound around the hut. Weber got up from the bunk and approached them. He asked if they could hear it. Both nodded. So now it wasn't just him and Mueller. The creature had chosen everyone. Mueller also stood up, his face gray. Zimmerman sat on the bunk, his head in his hands. He muttered something about having to leave, that he had said it was dangerous here. Weber told him to shut up. The clicks grew louder, more frequent. Now it was almost a continuous crackling, as if someone were breaking dry branches. The sound circled around the hut, spinning faster and faster. Then everything fell silent. Absolute silence. Weber felt his heart sink. He remembered Hoffman's words. When the clicks stop, the hunt begins. They stood motionless, 5 men with weapons in their hands, in the middle of a wooden hut deep in the Black Forest, and waited. The blow came from the west wall. Something huge crashed into the logs, and the whole house shook. The boards creaked, and dust fell from the ceiling. Zimmerman cried out. A second blow thundered from the north. The third came from the east. The creatures struck the walls with methodical fury, circling the hut. Weber shouted for everyone to stay away from the walls and move to the center of the room. They huddled by the hearth, pointing their guns in different directions. The blows stopped. Silence fell. Then something rustled on the roof. Heavy. Scratching. It climbed up. It walked slowly across the roof, from ridge to edge. The shingles creaked under its weight. Weber raised his rifle, aiming at the ceiling. The footsteps stopped right above them. A few seconds passed. Then a crack appeared in the roof. It was thin, but it was widening, spreading. Something was breaking through the shingles. Sharp. Hard. Weber fired at the ceiling. The deafening noise in the enclosed space stunned everyone. The shot pierced the boards and flew out. There was a sharp screech from the roof, as if someone were scraping iron against stone. Then a heavy thud on the ground outside. It jumped off. Weber reloaded the gun with trembling hands. His ears rang from the shot. Schmidt also fired at the wall when scratching sounds came from outside. Weber yelled at him to stop. They were running out of ammunition. They stood in the middle of the room all night, huddled together. Outside, the creature walked around the hut, scratching at the walls and banging on the door. Sometimes it climbed onto the roof, walked around there and scratched, but it didn't try to get inside after Weber fired his shot. Only when dawn broke did the sound stop. The creature went into the forest. At dawn, Weber ordered everyone to get ready. They were leaving this place immediately. No one objected. Even Schmidt, who had insisted on staying just yesterday, was now silent, his face gaunt, his hands shaking. They gathered only the bare essentials: weapons, a little food, water flasks. They harnessed the horse to the cart, but it was nervous, snorting and backing away, unwilling to approach the hut. Hoffman had to calm it down for a long time, stroking its muzzle and whispering something to it. When they finally set off, the sun had already risen above the trees. The forest greeted them with silence. Unfamiliar, oppressive. No birds, no squirrels, no rustling of leaves. Only the creaking of the wagon wheels and the pounding of hooves. Weber sat in front, holding his rifle on his knees, constantly looking back. The others sat in the back, also with their weapons at the ready. They had traveled about a kilometer when Mueller shouted. Weber turned around sharply. The young forester was pointing into the forest, away from the road. There, between the trees, about 30 meters away from them, something was standing. Tall, gray, motionless. Weber stopped the cart and looked closely. It was a creature a whole head taller than a man. It had long, thin legs, bent in unnatural places. Like a bird, a thin body covered with stiff gray feathers, a long neck, curved in the shape of the letter S, and a head. The head has a long, sharp beak, similar to that of a heron, only more massive. The eyes are round, unblinking, yellow, like an owl's. The creature stood completely still, only its head slowly turning, following them. Its neck rotated, its vertebrae clicking. Click, click, click. That same sound. Weber raised his rifle and took aim. Schmidt raised his as well. The creature did not move. It just stared and turned its neck. Click, click. Weber fired. The shot went into the forest, but the creature vanished. It simply dissolved between the trees, as if it had never been there. Weber reloaded his rifle, staring at the spot where it had been standing. Nothing. Only trees and shadows. He ordered them to move on, faster. Hoffman cracked the reins and the horse bolted. They raced along the forest road, the wagon bouncing over roots and stones. Weber kept looking back, watching for pursuers, and he saw them. A gray figure flashed between the trees to the right of the road. It ran parallel to them, keeping pace. Long legs carried it at incredible speed, its body swaying, its neck stretched forward. It made no sound. It just ran, never losing sight of them. Then a second figure appeared on the left. The same. Gray, long-legged with a curved neck. Then a third. They surrounded the wagon, running on both sides. Zimmerman shouted and started shooting into the forest. Schmidt also opened fire. Flashes, booms, smoke. Figures flashed between the trees, appearing and disappearing. It was impossible to tell if the shots had hit their targets. The road led them to an open area, an old clearing overgrown with young pine trees. It was lighter and more spacious here. Weber looked back. The creatures had remained in the forest, not coming out into the open. They stood at the edge of the forest, 3 gray figures, motionless, only their necks slowly turning. The clicks could be heard even from a distance, faint but distinct. Then the creatures turned and melted into the depths of the forest. They drove the rest of the way to Altenstieg without stopping. They entered the village closer to evening. People came out of their houses and looked at them in surprise. The foresters' faces were white, their clothes were smeared with mud, and their eyes were feverishly shining. Weber stopped at the mayor's house and jumped off the cart. His legs buckled and he could barely stand. The village head came out to meet him and asked what had happened. Weber told him. The mayor listened, frowning. When Weber finished, the mayor shook his head and said that they needed to report it to the forestry department and call the police. Perhaps there were bandits operating in the forest, scaring people away so they wouldn't go into the woods. Weber tried to explain that they weren't bandits. that he had seen the creatures with his own eyes. But the mayor just shrugged and said that you can see many things in the twilight. 2 days later, a commission from the forestry department arrived in Altensteig, accompanied by a constable and 4 of his assistants. They questioned the foresters separately and recorded their statements. The statements differed in detail, but the essence was the same. Something unknown had attacked the hut in the forest. The commission decided to go to the scene to investigate. Weber refused to go. So did Mueller. Schmidt, Hoffman, and Zimmerman agreed to accompany the commission. They were forced to do so under threat of dismissal. They left the next morning, a group of 8, well armed. They returned 3 days later. They brought back the bodies of Schmidt and Hoffman. Zimmerman survived, but could not speak. He sat staring at a single point and only shook his head when addressed. A member of the commission, an official named Mayer, gave testimony. They found the hut ransacked. The walls were broken, the roof was partially collapsed, and the door was torn off its hinges. Inside, they found traces of blood and scratches on the floor. Deep grooves, as if someone had scraped their claws across the boards. Around the hut, they found many strange tracks, just like the ones Hoffman had described. They spent the first night in the hut after repairing the door. During the night, they heard clicking noises around the building. In the morning, the constable ordered a search of the surrounding area. They split into 2 groups. Schmidt's group went west. No one saw them alive again. They were found a few hours later, 800 meters from the hut. The bodies were so mutilated that they could only be identified by their clothing. Multiple deep wounds, broken bones, faces. Mayer couldn't finish his sentence. He just turned pale and fell silent. Zimmerman was found alive next to the bodies. He had crawled under a fallen tree, covered his ears with his hands, and was unresponsive. He was pulled out by force and put into a cart. The commission immediately left the site, without even waiting until evening. On the way back, they saw gray figures among the trees several times, but they did not attack, only watched. The case was officially closed as an attack by an unknown large predator. The report recommended organizing a hunt for the animal with the help of experienced hunters and dogs. The hunt took place a week later. A group of 20 people with hounds combed through the entire forest area. They found nothing. No tracks, no lair, no bones of victims, nothing. It was as if no one had ever been there. Weber's diary was confiscated as evidence. In it, he described in detail everything that happened. Clicks, sounds, scratches, creatures in the forest. On the last page of the diary, a discovery Weber had made on the last morning before leaving the cabin was glued with a drop of wood glue. He found it on the threshold as he was leaving. It was a long gray feather, almost 30 centimeters long, with a stiff shaft and coarse barbs. A feather unlike any known European bird. The diary and the feather were kept in the archives of the forestry department until 1912, when the building burned down under unexplained circumstances. Most of the documents were destroyed. What remained was transferred to the state archives, where they remained until the end of World War II. After the war, many archives were looted or destroyed. Weber's diary is considered lost. Weber lived until 1903. He never returned to the Black Forest, transferring to work in the forestry service in northern Germany, near Hamburg. Muller left the forestry service, moved to Stuttgart, and worked as a clerk in an office. He died in 1921 of pneumonia. Zimmerman spent the rest of his life in a mental hospital near Freiburg. He never spoke again until his death in 1918. The section of forest where the hut was located was officially closed to visitors in 1882 under the pretext of sanitary logging. The hut was demolished and the site cleared, but the lumberjacks who worked there complained of strange sounds at night. Rhythmic clicks coming from deep within the forest. 2 of them went missing. After that, work was stopped, and the area was left to grow over. Local residents still avoid this part of the Black Forest. The elders in the villages remember the legends passed down from generation to generation. They say that deep in the forest, where no human foot has ever trod, lives something ancient and hungry, something that watches those who have violated the boundaries of its domain. It watches for months, turning its long neck, making its vertebrae click. And when the clicks stop, it means the surveillance is over. The hunt begins. They warn you never to say its name out loud. TikTok lead. Whoever utters it will hear the clicks, and whoever hears them is doomed.